All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to night 3 of Mighty and Immeasurable, the Legacy of Ludwig van Beethoven. So great to see many people in the room here tonight, despite the fact that it is raining, and I understand it's an important night for politics, which is somewhat apropos, being that Beethoven himself was very much into politics. As many of you may or may not know, Beethoven was a product of the Enlightenment period. He was a teenager at the time that the French Revolution broke out. He was a great believer in the capital R Republican ideals of the time, that society should be governed by the rules of meritocracy, and that one's station in life should be dictated by their skill, their talent, their contributions. Of course, Napoleon was his hero, but famously, Napoleon crowned himself emperor, and Beethoven has a great line. He said, "So he too is just a man." In other words, for Beethoven, Napoleon represented something bigger than the standard tyrannical, despotically inclined monarch of the period and of the preceding eras. He thought that this was a guy who was going to lead the vanguard into this new era, this revolution. It was a revolution, of course, and society would change, but not where Beethoven lived. In France, society would become far more progressive, more liberal, if you like. However, in Austria, where Beethoven lived, the opposite effect took place, because, you see, at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, after the defeat of Napoleon, Metternich, who took over as the de facto ruler of Austria, was paranoid. Why was he paranoid? Well, one can't blame him for being somewhat paranoid. After all, what had they done to the various counts and dukes and princes, etc., over in France? Well, they had their heads separated from their shoulders, which I'm told is lethal. It's a mortal, it's a mortal infliction. At any rate, so where Beethoven was, the impact of the French Revolution, we could spend many programs just talking about this and its impact on the music, some of it very good music, some of it not so good music. I think some of the worst pieces in Beethoven's catalog. And yes, it's not a sacrilege to say that. Like anybody else, Beethoven's going to have his hits. He's going to have perhaps a miss or two. Some of the misses would include pieces like Das glorreiche Augenblick, the glorious moment, written right after the defeat of Napoleon. Das glorreiche Augenblick, the glorious moment. But probably one of the strangest and least impressive pieces in the catalog, some of you know where I'm going with this, is Sieg des Wellington, Wellington's victory, which is about the Duke of Wellington defeating Napoleon's brother at a battle in in Spain. And the music, the first time you hear it, is great. It's so novel and wonderful, because what he does is he sets up the orchestra to represent the opposing armies getting ready to do battle. So we have a snare drum, because that's a typical military instrument, and it does a crescendo. What does the effect of the crescendo? Brings the action closer to you, the audience. First, it's quiet, as if in the distance, and then a bugle call comes in, and then we hear Rue Britannia. Now, why do we hear? Because it's the English army has arrived at the battlefield. And then, of course, we get another snare drum crescendo, and more fanfare, and then we hear the Marseillaise as the French army arrives. And it's kind of interesting the first time you hear it, and then it loses all its novelty, and it's rather paper thin. And it seems to have been the case that Beethoven himself was not especially committed to the idea of writing these pieces, but as I tell my students all the time, musicians have to eat. And sometimes we can't be picky about the kind of gigs we take, and that certainly was true for Beethoven. Today we're going to talk about that, because some of his vocal music, specifically some of his songs, were written, of all things, for a publisher in the UK who paid Beethoven a lot of money to write songs which Beethoven sort of dashed off, having no clue that posterity would put them under a microscope and compare them to the rest of his output in, it must be said, mostly unfavorable terms. Beethoven, as a composer of vocal music, again, to use the expression we just touched on, was a bit hit or miss. Now, many of his vocal works are today considered some of the tremendous masterpieces in the Western canon. The Missa Solemnis, though it's extremely difficult, and therefore the frequency at which it is performed is, well, it's a rather infrequent thing to see on the program, because community choruses and amateur singers would struggle mightily with it. There's that word again, mighty. Mighty and immeasurable, the legacy of Beethoven. Some of his works were received with a chilly reception in the eras during which they were premiered, and have gone on to garner acclaim and something bordering on reverence from modern audiences. One piece that seems to have sparked instant reverence at the time of its premiere was the Ninth Symphony, which of course premiered in May of 1823. And when it premiered, folks in the audience seemed to have understood that they had just witnessed something on the order of the miraculous, something that would not be repeated again in their lifetimes and perhaps would never be equaled. And to this day, one could make the case that the finale of the Ninth Symphony remains, even today, unchallenged in the canon of Western art music as perhaps the brightest proverbial feather in the cap of Western civilization. The brightest jewel in the crown, insert your metaphor here. Nonetheless, some of his vocal works sort of fell flat. Now, why did they fall flat? A number of reasons. First of all, as we saw last week with piano music, and we're going to revisit piano music shortly because I promised you something at the end of the last lecture, and I told you you'd have to come tonight to connect the dots that the breadcrumb trail that we laid out last week. One of the things that we saw with Beethoven's piano music, simply put, is that it is, I'm thinking of a four-letter word, starts with H. It's hard, folks. The music's hard, yes. You know, the principle of Occam's razor, the simplest answer is usually the correct one. It's hard music. Now, we saw that when we looked at the third movement of the Moonlight Sonata. And we could have looked at any other number of sonatas by Beethoven, the Hammerklavier, number 29 in B-flat major, to this day regarded as one of the most challenging pieces in the repertoire, even 200 years later. And that's compared to Rachmaninoff, compared to Prokofiev, compared to those crazy Russian composers who could reach an octave and a fifth on one hand, if you believe the stories about Rachmaninoff. That piece, the Hammerklavier Sonata, is still regarded as one of the boogeymen in the repertoire that even the most intrepid pianists are sometimes hesitant to attempt to learn it and perform it. Now, what might we extrapolate? If we're talking about his keyboard music, what might we say about his vocal music? Well, similar to the keyboard music, it's going to be exceptionally difficult. Now, in the case of piano music, as you'll recall from our discussion last week, well, the piano was steadily evolving. And the new hardware gave Beethoven a reason, or perhaps a justification, for writing repertoire that was unprecedented in scope and difficulty. But the human voice hasn't really changed much in, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 years. So what's the justification for writing vocal music that is so taxing, so tremendously and awesomely difficult to perform? Well, it would be tempting to posit a theory that perhaps because Beethoven was deaf, perhaps that's why his vocal music is so unusually difficult. Maybe it has to do with the fact that he couldn't hear, or for some reason he didn't understand how the voice worked. Recall, however, that Beethoven was not born deaf, folks. Beethoven became deaf steadily over a period probably spanning as many as 15 or even 20 years. We touched on this question in an earlier program, and I was asked a question which I think is a very good question to ask, which is, how does a deaf person compose? And we said that the answer really has to do with memory. And it has to do with oral recall, the ability to hear things in one's own head without having an external sound source. And Beethoven, we said, had that ability in spades. And as such, would not have needed to hear things out loud. With vocal music, he would have known what great singing sounded like. Recall that Beethoven grew up in the city of Bonn in Germany, in the western part of Germany, and in the area bordering France, near the city of Cologne. Beethoven knew how to write vocal music. He took lessons on counterpoint and voice leading. He would have known exactly what notes fit in which voices. We're going to talk about this today. For those of you who are not choral singers, you'll know an awful lot about choral singing by the time we're done. And I'll show you some specific moments in Beethoven's choral music where there seems to be a question of, well, I'm thinking of a three-letter word, starts with a W. Why? Why did he do that? Why does he make the basses go up all the way up to a high F and sort of sit there in the Ninth Symphony? Why does he have the sopranos hold a high A in the fifth octave for 12 measures without breathing in the Missa Solemnis Credo? Why does he do these things? And to this day, I think these are difficult questions to answer. They're very puzzling questions. So we're going to look at three genres today. First, the Mass. Second, the song, or Lied in German. And finally, we look and turn our attention at the end to the Ninth Symphony, which, as I said earlier, remains to this day one of the most celebrated pieces of music, not just for Beethoven, not just for the so-called classical period or the romantic period, but just any music, any genre, any period. This particular excerpt, these 20 minutes or so, or 24 minutes, depending on the conductor and how hungry they are, or whatever it is, it's going to take less than a half hour. And yet, that span of, say, 20 or 25 minutes is going to leave a deep imprint on just about every listener who's going to encounter that music. And when I say a deep imprint, I don't mean that they have to love it, or they have to exalt it and embrace it. But they're going to remember it. They're going to recognize it. They'll be able to sing it or whistle it or hum it. So three genres today to look at: the Mass, the Lied or song, and then finally we're going to look at this wonderfully bizarre example of what is sometimes called the Choral Symphony, which in its own context doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because the word symphony, if you were to look it up in the Oxford Dictionary or in the Grove Music Dictionary, what you would find is a definition that reads something like this: the symphony is a multi-movement work for an orchestra comprised of strings, woodwind instruments, brass, and percussion. Notice what's missing there, folks. It doesn't say anything about choirs, chorales, choruses. It doesn't say anything about voice, because up until Beethoven 9, there are no voices in the symphony. So we're going to talk about this today, but first I want to wrap up our discussion of keyboard repertoire. We could spend hours talking about Beethoven's impact on the next generation. I'm going to give you 2 or 3 anecdotes or particular examples that make a wonderful testament to Beethoven's impact on the next generations. First of all, it should be said that Beethoven's successors worshipped him. I don't just use that word flippantly. They really worshipped at his altar. In fact, when I began my career, the first textbook I used was Cengage edition, 6th edition of Listening to Music. And the cover of the textbook was a guy with blonde hair wearing a black robe, but we don't see his face. His back is to us. And he's sitting on almost a precipice, a sort of an overhang that overlooks a valley, and the sun's coming up in the valley. So it's very Nietzschean. It's like Also sprach Zarathustra. The sun is rising, and the Übermensch is surveying the sunrise, getting ready to save humanity from its sloth. And yet this particular Übermensch is not really Superman. He's more of a priestly figure, and the black robe tips us off. We don't see his face, but we know who it is. I'll ask you who it is in a moment. Now he's sitting at a bench on this cliff overlooking the valley. And on this cliff there happens to be sort of a marble plinth. And that's where he's sitting. And he's sitting at a piano. Nice place to put a piano. And there's a bust on the piano, a marble bust of Beethoven. And the image is very clear. The piano is the temple, it's the church. The bust of Beethoven tells us who the deity is. That Beethoven, to those composers, is God. God the Father. There he is. Majestic and stern and grim looking. Almost every picture of Beethoven shows him looking rather grim. Not a very smiley figure. And finally we have the priest figure. Well, I gave you a hint. He has shoulder-length blonde hair. And he's playing the piano. Not Chopin, not Mozart. Mozart predates Beethoven. It's not Chopin, but it's very much Chopin's counterpart in many ways. Not Schubert. Someone said it starts with an L. Liszt. It's Franz Liszt. Franz Liszt, the great Hungarian piano virtuoso. Liszt is the priest. What does the priest do? Well, historically, think back to medieval times in Europe, where most of the population working in an agrarian community, they can't read or write, but they're fervent in their devotion, and they rely on that priest to interpret Scripture for them, to share that good news, right? The Gospels. Here, Liszt is the priest. He's interpreting Beethoven. You see that? Beethoven is God. Beethoven is Scripture. Beethoven is divine. And the piano is the altar upon which this act is performed. It's a remarkable image. Of course, they replaced it a year later with something generic like a mannequin wearing headphones. Not very imaginative, that. All right. So let me give you two examples of Beethoven's impact on the next generation. Number one, because this program series, Mighty and Immeasurable, the Legacy. So legacy, impact, influence. Beethoven's music, if we were to look at the Appassionata Sonata in F minor, the final movement is something on the order of a perpetuum mobile. In other words, it requires the pianist to play a non-stop stream of notes that continues for about 7 minutes. And when you get to the end, what we call the coda or tail, well, I have good news and bad news. The good news is, finally, mercifully, there's a tempo change. The bad news is it only gets faster. This idea of taking something frenetic and incredibly motoric and driven and then intensifying it at the end, composers are going to run with this idea. A great example is Robert Schumann, who in his G minor piano sonata writes the following direction in the fourth movement. He says in German, so schnell wie möglich, which means as fast as possible. Then, composers always write a tempo mark. Allegro, andante, allegro vivace, presto agitato, whatever it is. Always not always, usually in Italian. In Beethoven's day, almost always in Italian. So, instead of saying fast or really fast, it says as fast as possible. Then you get to the coda and it says noch schneller, even faster. Now, how does that work? Well, you see, because it's not conceived metronomically. You're not going to say, okay, well, I'm going to go 268 beats per minute here, and then I'm going to go to 200. It's a feeling. And Beethoven is the one who opens the floodgates for composers. We said this, remember, in our November series. We talked about the shift in the aesthetic perception of music from the beginning of the Enlightenment period to the end, to this sort of anti-Enlightenment idea, that in the Enlightenment period, Mozart and Haydn and their contemporaries, they're composing music that should sound well-regulated and balanced and melodic and smooth. I don't mean smooth like Kenny G. I mean chord progressions that make sense, balanced phrases of antecedent and consequent lines. But Beethoven, by rejecting that idea, by modulating to far-off keys, by having these abrupt shifts between major and minor, as we saw in the Fifth Symphony in week 1 and into week 2, he's rejecting that. And therefore, it's an aesthetic which is not based on strict adherence to rules. By definition, right, he's breaking the rules. So what is it? It's about feeling. It's about emotion. It's about expressivity. And when we translate that to tempo markings, it's hard to do it. So what does Schumann do? He says, so schnell wie möglich, as fast as possible. Because he wants the intensity of a person who's hanging on for dear life as they're playing. Do you see that? He could have written vivacissimo, which is basically the fastest mark on a metronome. But that's not the feeling he wants. He wants it to have a, whatever, I shouldn't say, I don't know what he wants. Until there's a time machine invented and we go back and ask him, we don't know. Nobody can. In musicology, we encounter this very often. We call this the fallacy of surmising composer's intention. You can't know what a composer thinks, but we can suppose, we can conjecture, we can posit that he writes so schnell wie möglich for a reason. And I would say that Beethoven's music certainly has a very big impact. All right, now I'll show you a more direct impact. Here's the end of the Moonlight Sonata, which we heard last week. We start with these rolling chords at the end. Remember this? And then we wind up. When we get to this section where it's very free, we call this a cadenza. Cadenza is related to the word cadence, meaning we're just about at the end. And it sounds like this. We get this big chromatic rise, chromatic meaning using every tone. Feels very unfinished, doesn't it? And then it drops. Listen to it. It's a very unusual pattern of notes. And yet we're going to find that exact pattern of notes, and I mean exact, verbatim, squirreled away in one of Chopin's most famous piano works, the Opus 56 Fantasy Impromptu, which is in the same key. That piece, if you recall, sounds like this. Stop. Let's slow it down. It's based on a big polyrhythm. So the right hand is doing patterns of 4. The left hand has to play 3 against every 4. So if you're doing, let's do it slowly. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Slow down. Now you have to actually play notes with it. Now, did you hear that? So, I'll play the right hand. Exactly as Beethoven. Do you hear that? It's exactly the same, in the same key. Coincidence? I think 9. It's not a coincidence. All right, let's look at some vocal music. So let's talk about the Mass. Mass is an incredibly important musical genre, of course. It's based on a setting. The idea of a musical Mass is very simple, really. It's a setting to music of the words, the 5 parts of the Catholic Mass ordinary. Why is it called the ordinary? Because these are the words that will be spoken on a regular basis, as opposed to a feast day or a holiday. And they consist of 5 parts. The first part is the Kyrie. Kyrie comes from Greek, Ancient Greek, Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, Christe eleison, Christ have mercy. So it has a sort of plaintive quality sometimes. We go from there to the most robust often and the most vigorous section of the Mass setting, musically speaking. That's the Gloria. Gloria in excelsis Deo et in terra pax hominibus bone voluntatis, etc., etc. There's quite a bit of text in the Gloria, but not nearly as much. You folks who are familiar with the Mass ordinary text know what comes next, the Credo, which goes on and on with loads and loads of words, which gives composers quite a bit of music to compose to it, right? They've got to set an awful lot of text. Credo in unum, I believe in one God. And then we get the Sanctus, fifth, and finally the Agnus Dei. Agnus Dei qui tollis peccata mundum. Qui tollis peccata mundi, dona nobis pacem. Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, grant unto us peace. Now this idea of taking the Catholic Mass ordinary text and setting it to music goes back to the Middle Ages, goes back to the 14th century. Composers like Guillaume de Machaut, composers in the next generations, in the early Renaissance, like Josquin des Prez. In the 16th century, composers like Palestrina. Catholic composers, even in England, William Byrd, in the late 16th century, wrote a few settings of the Mass. Let me suggest that writing a Mass in 16th century England could have been a dangerous enterprise. That's a very tumultuous period in England, and of course, good old King Henry VIII, Gesundheit, King Henry VIII, who establishes himself in the 1530s as the head of the Church, of essentially what's going to become the Church of England, thus really establishing hierarchical superiority over the Pope. It's a tremendous shift, and by the time you get to Henry's successors, Edward VI, he's sort of controlled by a Protestant faction, mostly his uncle, Thomas Seymour. And then he dies at the age of 15, and then we have Queen Mary I, who is so zealous in her attempts to restore Orthodox Catholicism that it earns her the nickname Bloody Mary. And then after that, 45 years from 1558 to 1603, of the red-haired virgin queen, Elizabeth I, who rules over a period of relative stability and prosperity in England. One of my favorite stories about Elizabeth is that, that's my favorite story, you'll see why in a minute, is that she was apparently a very vain woman, which we can forgive her that, right? I mean, she was the queen of England after all, and therefore it stands to reason that she would be concerned with how she looked and appeared. But one of her quirks was that she was apparently obsessed with having fresh breath. And so what did she do to ensure having sweet breath? Well, she ate candies. And by the time she was in her 50s, she had very few teeth remaining. Now, being married to a dentist, I can't help but find this story incredibly illuminating. Can you imagine the idea of, well, let's, instead of rinsing with mouthwash or chewing gum, let's have a Snickers bar. That's essentially what this woman did for decades. Another quirk of Elizabeth's was that, again, because she sought to present a very attractive appearance, she used quite a bit of makeup. Now, the cosmetic industry in the 16th century was rather primitive by today's standards, and her preferred makeup at the time was a blend of crushed eggshells, talcum powder, and, oh yeah, lead. So it's rather remarkable that she lived 7 decades. Nonetheless, the Mass, we're talking about the Mass. It's an incredibly important musical genre, and just about every composer is going to set the Catholic Mass ordinary to music. Now you could say, wait a second, Gil. Why would Bach set the ordinary? After all, wasn't he a Lutheran? And as such, what would a Lutheran be doing touching the Catholic Mass text, which is, of course, in Latin? And the answer is yes. Not only did Bach write a Mass, the B minor Mass, he also wrote 5 what are called kleine Messe. And if you don't know them, the 5 little Masses, they're about the length of a cantata. They're wonderful pieces. They're wonderful. And they are available, of course, on YouTube. Just type in Bach short Mass or little Mass. So Bach was a prolific composer. He didn't just write a couple. He wrote a tremendous amount of music settings of the Catholic Mass ordinary. And he did this, by the way, to curry favor with Catholics who were in a position to help him. So, for example, the new king of Poland in 1730s, Augustus the Strong, that's when he begins writing the B minor Mass. Okay. So we know that composers have written lots of masses. Just about every composer in the canon will set the Mass to music, including, by the way, Leonard Bernstein, Jewish composer, is going to set the Mass to music. Beethoven's going to set it twice, the Mass in C major and the Missa Solemnis. We'll leave the Missa Solemnis for another day, let's say. It's a massive piece. It's over 1 hour and 20 minutes in performance. It is almost unperformable unless you've got an exceptionally talented, but also a group that possesses tremendous stamina, because the challenge is in the tessitura, which is to say the notes and where they sit, but also in terms of the incredible duration of the piece. All right, here is the Gloria from Beethoven's Mass in C major. I'm going to play it for you, and I'm going to tell you what the patron who sponsored the work said about it. There's just a little bit of Beethoven's Mass in C major. Here's the Gloria. Here's that line, who takes away the sins of the world. All right, a couple of things to contend with here. It's not as difficult as the Missa Solemnis, but this came first. So it's not the most apt comparison. But let's just look at one particular moment that in some ways speaks to the difficulties one encounters when one sings Beethoven. Oh, let's take a look at the bass line here. Here's middle C, and here's B flat, an octave and a second below it. In the soprano, simultaneously, we have E in the 5th octave, D, an octave and a step below it. Let me explain what that means, because all this talk of octaves and range, it might sound very nebulous, it's sort of like gobbledygook, but it can be very easily demonstrated. Imagine for a moment that let's say someone was celebrating a birthday. Does anybody have a birthday coming up? Well, imagine we were going to sing Happy Birthday. But instead of singing it the way you're used to singing it, I told you to sing it like this. You would say, well, that's ludicrous. The human voice isn't really meant to do things like that. And, well, you might be right for most singers and casual musicians, but really good musicians can learn to do these particular drums. We call these intervals compound intervals. Anything beyond an octave in singing is considered to be sort of an extended technique interval, something that you would never really have to sing under normal circumstances. And therefore, you would never have to do it unless you were going on to study in a graduate program or something of the sort. But graduate program or not, Beethoven, if you want to sing this piece, you've got to negotiate these compound intervals. We can all try this. If you were to try to sing this note, here's middle C, and here's the B flat Beethoven asks right after it. That's an odd interval to sing. All the way up here, and then this note. Again, C, B flat. Even when I sing it, it feels funny, because it's just not an interval that you'd encounter very often, but there you have it. We also have the issue of range and stamina. Beethoven's going to ask the voices, and this is most prominently heard in the soprano part, where we have phrases like this one. Okay, it's not that bad here. In the Missa Solemnis, he asks them to sing this same note and to hold it for 12 measures. It's wonderful. It's great. All right, what can we say about this? How might we imagine that Beethoven's benefactor, in this case, Prince Nicholas II of the House of Esterházy, how would he have reacted to this? Well, the answer is unfavorably. Apparently, the quote goes something like this: "But, my dear Beethoven, what have you done?" Now, the thing about Esterházy is this guy was Haydn's last employer before Haydn sort of officially retires from working in Hungary. And he was used to the Haydn masses. And Haydn wrote, I think, something like 20 or 22 masses. He set the mass many times. If you were a choral singer, odds are you have sung a Haydn mass at some point in your time as a choral singer. Well, the best thing to do for us is to listen and compare. If this is what Beethoven's mass sounds like, let's look at a Gloria setting from a Haydn mass and see what exactly was Nikolaus II of the noble house of Esterházy. What was he missing? What was different about Beethoven's that sort of set him off? Well, we talked about the compound intervals and the extreme high notes. Let's listen to Haydn's style and see if we can determine what might be idiomatically different. So, a couple of minutes of Haydn. On the surface, it might be difficult to discern salient differences between the two, but there are. Let me show you an example of one thing that we hear in Haydn, which we don't get in the Beethoven. And it's close to where we stopped. In fact, okay. Laudamus te, we praise thee. Benedicimus te, we bless thee. If you look at the voices, what you'll see in this section is that they are all singing exactly the same notes at exactly the same time. They're in parallel, if you will. No need to find your notes and no need for the listener to parse out what notes may be buried in the harmony. It's very straightforward. Haydn also tends to give you very strictly delineated keys, which make a lot of sense. Did you notice when we ended how satisfying the ending felt? Listen to it again. Let's go. Did you hear that? We don't really get things like that in Beethoven, these nice rounded cadences. Beethoven tends to bulldoze his way from one key to another, sort of smash across the bar line, often with modulations through keys that have no business showing up in whatever key he started the piece in. So here we're in D major. The cadence we just heard goes to A major. Those are related keys. And I've used this analogy before. Keys in music are like languages. Beethoven started in Italian, he just cadenced in Spanish. Excuse me, Haydn. Beethoven sometimes starts in Japanese and then cadences in Swahili. Then he can start in C and then will be in E flat minor in the next section. It can be very abrupt. The brilliance of Beethoven is that those abrupt changes are very subtle to the ear because his voice leading is often very smooth. All right, we're going to move on now, and I'm going to talk about a genre which is going to take on immense importance in the coming years. And this is what's called the Lied, L-I-E-D. Beethoven was apparently undeterred by the flop that was the Mass in C major. He was very irritated with that whole trip. He was put up in accommodations which were, to him, completely unsuitable. And it was cold and rainy, and he was miserable. And the humiliation he suffered when the prince insulted his music, his setting of the Mass, was too much to bear. However, he would write an awful lot more vocal music, and this particular excerpt we're going to look at is a wonderful example of what is called in German ein Liederkreis, or a song cycle in English. Now, what is a song cycle? Well, we know what a song is, but we should clarify what the word Lied means in German. Lied means song, yes, but it means a lot more than that. Art song is probably a better translation in English. What's the difference? Well, a song is just, well, a voice, music, setting of words, perhaps with a piano accompaniment, or perhaps a cappella, or perhaps done in some other fashion. But the truth is that the word song is very broad, isn't it? After all, Take Me Out to the Ball Game is a song. Happy Birthday is a song. 99 bottles of beer on the wall technically is a song. But the word art song, or the term art song I should say, and the word in German is Lied, L-I-E-D, suggests something more sophisticated, more refined. And often what it was established high-quality poetry set to music in that order. Poetry, Composer reads the poetry and decides to set it to music for whatever reason, because the poetry resonates or because they've been paid a commission to do so. So Beethoven would go ahead and write this, this song cycle, and it's often interpreted as being, to at least some degree, autobiographical. Because Beethoven, as you know, never married. He never had kids. But we also know that he was a great, well, he loved women. It's not a secret. He enjoyed their company. He enjoyed the flirtation. He enjoyed the interaction, the camaraderie. He may have enjoyed to some degree the chase because he was coming from a lower station as a musician. He tended to fall in love with women who were well out of his range, you might say. They were people who he could have never conceivably married. He was deeply in love at the age of 30 or 31 with the Countess Giulia Guicciardi, who was the dedicatee of the Moonlight Sonata. She was a countess. She was the daughter of a diplomat, an Italian diplomat. No way she's going to marry Beethoven. Beethoven also, it must be said, was, well, a rather homely individual. He was apparently not at all a comely man. And we know this because it was remarked upon by most of the women with whom he flirted. At some point, these women seem to have recorded for posterity the very unfortunate statement of something to the degree of, he is rather ugly. Well, it seems mean and sort of ad hominem to attack him that way, but nonetheless, he never married, but he fell in love with women who were married. He fell in love with women who were from the classes that he were out of reach from. He was van Beethoven, not von Beethoven. V-O-N would have been a big difference. That would have suggested he came from a landowning family in Germany. But van Beethoven, all that meant was that he was, from a Dutch family. That's it. And it made no impact in his station. Now, in Beethoven's own day, plenty of people didn't know that, and he was in no hurry to correct them. He loved to be mistaken for a nobleman, even though, of course, he was not. But he considered himself to be one because, to paraphrase something he said, is it not the heart that ennobles a man? He saw himself as having great capacity for gifting humanity with his music, and therefore he may not have been rich, but he was wealthy in his abilities and his spirit, and so on. All right, let's take a look at this particular song cycle. An die ferne Geliebte means to the distant beloved. Ferne is far away. Geliebte is beloved. So it's this beautiful poetry which he sets to music, and we start with a strophic song. We'll just listen to the first song. And what's going to happen is the voice is going to sing the same words over and over again. Just like any other song where you've got different lyrics set to different verses. But the piano is going to change in every verse. So that's what to listen for here. And this is what Beethoven is often credited with doing, how he advanced the lead. That, songs have been around for a long time, but the idea was that it was always about the singer. Beethoven is going to elevate the importance of the piano as an equal part of the lead experience. And when you get to Schubert, in Schubert Lieder, the piano is of paramount importance. Who could forget Schubert's song? That is as hard as it looks, by the way. Schubert's Erlkönig, the song where the piano plays for 40 seconds before the singer even comes in. It's a paradigm shift, and it starts with Beethoven. Let's listen to An die ferne Geliebte. This is Fritz Wunderlich, by the way, singing, the great tenor who, tragically, we lost him all too early. It's a short cycle, 6 songs total, perhaps no more than 15 minutes in performance. They're really lovely songs, and they're going to do a lot to elevate the role of the lead, plural leader, the art song, in the mind of the coming composer. They're going to consider this to be a very important genre. Composers like Schubert, Brahms, Schumann, Mahler, they're synonymous with songs, aren't they? And I think it's fair to say that that starts with Beethoven. So you want to talk about the impact, the legacy of Beethoven. How many of us would think of vocal music as being part of that impact? We will often think Beethoven, struggled to some degree with his vocal music. We talked about the Mass in C major, some of the challenges and how its reception was, well, rather chilly at best. We talked about the Missa Solemnis and how even today, despite the fact that it is recognized as one of the great works in the repertoire, it's rarely performed because it is so difficult.
Who wrote the lyrics to his songs? Were they
Yeah, his name was Jeitlis. You can see here, Ein Liederkreis von, I believe it's Alfred Jeitlis. And you can see it's dedicated dem Fürsten Josef von Lobkowitz gewidmet. So dedicated to the Prince Joseph von Lobkowitz. And the poetry is by this guy Jeitlis. Now, some of the poets of the, in the lieder category in that genre are very famous. People like Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, or Heinrich Heine, or Johannes Eichendorff, or Müller. Later in the century, you're going to have Friedrich Rückert, whose music is going to be set by Clara Schumann and by Gustav Mahler in the famous Rückert lieder. So, it's a real symbiotic relationship because the poets have their music, they have their text, I should say, elevated and immortalized in a way. And the musicians get tremendous inspiration that they can draw from to channel that expressive quality that the music is going to have. So this is great music to check out. If you've got some time and you like songs, check out Beethoven's An die ferne Geliebte. It's hard to overstate how important the Liederkreis, you can see that word here, Liederkreis, the song cycle, is going to be in the next generation. But let me give you a few examples. Robert Schumann would write the Dichterliebe, the poet's love. Oh my goodness. You want to treat yourself to an indulgence, folks. That's not just good music, that's an indulgence. Because the Dichterliebe is so poignant at times that if you can make it through without a Kleenex, maybe your tear ducts are malfunctioning. So Schumann's Dichterliebe. Earlier than that, you have Franz Schubert writes two amazing song cycles, actually three. One is called Die schöne Müllerin, the beautiful miller's maid. And then towards the end of his life, he writes an incredible cycle based on poetry that's so bleak and so grim and so heartbreaking. It's basically about a man who is rejected in love and wanders around in the winter, seeking solace in nature, until finally, at the very end, he's frozen and starved, and he's on the outskirts of a town, and he meets an old man playing a hurdy-gurdy, just cranking the hurdy-gurdy. And what he says to him in the last song, the 24th song in the cycle, this has 6. Schubert's Winterreise is over an hour, it's 24 songs. And he says to him, Wunderlicher Alter, you strange old man, if I give you my songs, will you play them here? And then he presumably dies. He joins the old man in freezing to death. It's bleak and heartbreaking. That particular cycle is called Winterreise. I think you could make the case that without An die ferne Geliebte, there is no schöne Müllerin, there is no Winterreise, there's no Dichterliebe, there's no Frauen lieben und leben, women in love and in life, which is a Schumann cycle. There's no Schwanengesang, swan songs, also by Schubert. The song cycle is going to be huge. It's going to be one of the most important new genres of the 19th century. And you could draw a dotted line back to Beethoven. So here we've learned something that perhaps we didn't know, that Beethoven has a deep impact on composers of vocal music. Well, we know that is going to be the case in the Choral Symphony. We're not going to listen to all of the finale of Beethoven 9. Here's Daniel Barenboim looking very intense. The Ninth Symphony has no business featuring a chorus. We said that. A chorus historically had been used to sing a cappella music, especially in the medieval and the Renaissance eras, where instruments and voices did not commingle. Why not? Because in church, music was thought by the Renaissance theorists and the medieval theorists before them that the voice was God's instrument. God gave, what does it say in Genesis? And God breathed into his nostril the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And so therefore, if God created us and made us in his own image and gave us voices, that the voice has a sort of sacred place in music. And if you have instruments in church and you're playing and they're working together, now it's not an act of devotion. Now it's a concert. And they were uncomfortable with this. That's going to change with the Lutheran Reformation and the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, starting in 1517. It's going to change in England. It's going to change in Germany. And by the 18th century, the idea of having voices and instruments is par for the course. But the symphony never featured voices. It was always a purely instrumental genre. Haydn wrote 106 symphonies, officially 104, but actually 106. 0 feature voices. Mozart wrote 41 symphonies. 0 have voices. And I'm sure that neither Mozart nor Haydn ever even contemplated putting voices in their symphony. But Mozart died in 1791 and Haydn died in 1809. And this is the 1820s. Beethoven's sort of an old, well, we can imagine he's rather crotchety at this point. He's got a bad temper. He's sort of fed up with the Viennese audiences, whom he considered to be incredibly fickle, capricious, ignorant. If you had asked people in the 18-teens or the 1820s who's the most popular composer in Europe, they would have said, that's easy, Rossini. So Beethoven's popularity had faded to some degree. He had been through an ugly custody battle with his sister-in-law over the wardship of his nephew Karl. It was a disaster for him. We can almost imagine that as he's nearing the end of his life, and he's already accomplished so much, he's had a period of productivity in the early 19th century, which is hard to imagine will ever be equaled again by any artist working in this idiom. Absolutely prolific. And he gets to writing his Ninth Symphony, and who knows, perhaps he was cognizant of the fact that this would be his last symphony. Who knows? Probably not, because there are sketches, skeletal sketches for what would have been a 10th Symphony. But nonetheless, he gets to the finale, and we've had 40-some-odd minutes of music already. And all of a sudden, the orchestra, before they cue up, the chorus often rises. They stand. We can imagine that the audience would have been rather perplexed by this, after all. They knew that what they were seeing was a symphony. After all, it says so in the program. So what is that chorus doing there? The answer is they're singing words by Friedrich Schiller. The famous poem An die Freude, which starts, Freude schöner Götterfunken, Tochter aus Elysium. Joy, the daughter of the divine spark, the daughter of Elysium. Wir betreten Feuertrunken. We enter drunk with fire. Himmlische dein Heiligtum, into your heavenly abode. Deine Zauber binden wieder, your magic repairs, binds together. Was die Mode streng geteilt, was custom has divided, has separated. Alle Menschen werden Bruder, wo dein sanfter Flügel weilt. All men become Bruder, brothers. It's kind of a paradoxical message coming from this grouchy, very difficult man, right? After all, we know Beethoven was abusive towards many people in his life, especially his sister-in-law, who, whatever she might have been guilty of, was certainly not, had never earned the excoriating, scathing ad hominem attacks that Beethoven launched at her in an attempt to destroy her reputation so that he might have the custody of his nephew. Nonetheless, you might think of this symphony, it's sometimes been interpreted as a kind of an olive branch. Not just to his sister-in-law or to the Viennese public that he had scorned, or to anyone in particular, Beethoven, his mum on the issue. But we can think of it as representing this ultimate message of brotherhood, of togetherness. It's an invitation, not just to not be mad at a person, but to forget that you were ever mad in the first place. let's listen to, we're going to start with the tenor solo, where the tenor is singing Froh, froh, wie ein Held zum Siegen, happy as a hero on to victory. All right, we go into a solo quartet. I'm going to jump ahead to the tenor solo. That's the first time that the chorus intones the melody that's going to become one of the most famous melodies, not just in the canon of Western art music, but simply ever. But here's the tenor solo that leads into the big moment. All right. We stop there. There's so many things we could say about this. It seems an inexhaustible treasure trove for students of not just music history, but history in general. We're going to talk more about this next week when we consider and weigh the impact of Beethoven on various aspects of the last 200 years in our history, both cultural, but also military, technological, the film industry. We're going to look at many different examples, but I would say that if we're looking for an impact here, we can see it in really a couple of ways. The first way is one that might surprise you. If you were asked, what is the legacy, the impact of Beethoven 9, there's two answers. One is that there are some composers who are going to avoid writing symphonies altogether. They're going to avoid the symphonic genre as if it were coronavirus. They're going to go nowhere near it. They're not interested in symphonies. They're not going to touch the symphony. And we just heard the reason why they're not going to touch the symphony. How do you write a symphony after this? Do you copy Beethoven and put voices in because voices have that expressive power to elevate it? Well, if you do that, you're sort of copying him. You're not doing anything original. And for the Romantics, originality was paramount. And we have so many composers who don't touch the symphony. Verdi never wrote a symphony. Chopin never wrote a symphony. Wagner certainly never wrote a symphony. Some composers would write symphonies, but they'd go in a different direction, writing program symphonies. People like Hector Berlioz or Liszt. They would write symphonies, but their symphonies had stories, and they were using the instruments to evoke different characters and scenes. And then you'd get some composers who would basically say, oh, what the heck. You know what? You can't run from it. I'm going to embrace what Beethoven did, and I'm going to try to honor that legacy, but still contribute something meaningful and original. And the best example of that is Gustav Mahler. And that would be a great topic, I think, for future discussion, to look at Mahler's symphonies. Symphony number 2, symphony number 5, where you want to talk about the impact of voices and a choral symphony. We see it in Mahler. All right, let me tell you what's on tap for next week, and then I will bid you adieu. Next week, we're going to look at all the genres we've looked at. We're going to look at the one that Beethoven was working on at the very end of his life. And this is the genre of chamber music, and specifically string quartets. Beethoven had written plenty of small-scale chamber works, some fabulous piano trios, such as the Archduke Trio or the Ghost Trio. He himself was, of course, up until probably the age of 40, and one of the most gifted and perhaps unparalleled pianists in all of Europe. But as his hearing deteriorated, so too did his ability to play chamber music. He couldn't play anymore. After all, chamber music means coordinating in a very intimate and very close-knit way with the handful of musicians who are performing. So perhaps for that reason, or for some reason we cannot decipher, it's at the end of his life that he's working, sitting in bed, bedridden, sick, plagued with all sorts of issues related to gastritis and gout and headaches and toothaches. His body is literally collapsing, failing him. And he's just sitting there writing these brilliant string quartets. So we're going to look at some of Beethoven's quartet music next week. We'll look at some earlier examples, and then we'll compare, see what the early examples sound like compared to the Opus 130 and beyond. And then we'll talk about the impact and the legacy, not just of those works, but of Beethoven taken from a more panoramic viewpoint to see how he has impacted our lives in ways that we are conscious of and in ways that we are perhaps oblivious to, or at least incognizant of. I think that's going to be a very illuminating and hopefully enjoyable session. Can't wait to see you all next week when we wrap up this excellent 4-part series. And thank you once again to the Darien Library and to Pat for making it happen.